Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome John Mackey, co-founder and co-CEO of Whole Foods Market and the guiding spirit behind the conscious capitalism movement. We caught up with John on the show floor of Freedom Fest in Las Vegas. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bill.
John, I asked you on because you're such a fascinating study in contrast. You're a philosophy major who dropped out of college and yet became the Entrepreneur of the Year in 2003. Wikipedia calls you out for your strong anti-union views, yet applauds your advocacy of organic food. You identify yourself as a vegan, yet your company sells some of the tastiest sausages in town. How does one square the circle of your life?
I don't think it's that complicated. I don't think it's difficult to do. I'm not anti-union. I just don't like the fact that unions try to force people to join their unions against their will, and I think people ought to have free choice whether to participate in unions or not. In the closed shop, they get fired if they don't join a union, so I don't think that's a good idea, but I'm not anti-union. Unions have served an important historical purpose, particularly in countries like Poland when they were breaking people away from communism. Yeah, I'm personally a vegan, but we have to sell the foods that people want to buy. If I just sold foods that I personally wanted to eat, you wouldn't have a business.
It wouldn't be much of a menu.
I mean, business has to serve the market. If it's trying to serve an ideology, it's probably going to fail. So I just don't see the contradictions that others tend to see. Most business people don't see contradictions. They understand the pressures in the marketplace and the choices that businesses have to make to make their market happy.
Let's get into your philosophy a little bit. The word capitalism is supposedly coined by Karl Marx, after which his economic theories went on to kill maybe 100 million people. More recently, over 1 billion people have pulled themselves out of extreme poverty through voluntary exchange, entrepreneurship, competition, and respect for property rights. Basically, the ingredients of capitalism. Despite this historical record, college students are said to hold socialism in higher regard. Why do you figure that is?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. First, youth is idealistic, but very ignorant of history for the most part. The millennial generation, very idealistic, not very well read.
Right.
So they don't really know what happened, and they don't understand it. And socialism dares to be utopian, as Friedrich Hayek said. Capitalism, the defenders pride themselves on their realism, and that's the way the real world works. And I think it would well serve capitalism, the defenders of capitalism, to be much more upfront about the value creation that capitalism has done. As you stated, it's lifted billions of people out of poverty. It's increased prosperity tremendously, not just for a few rich people, but across the world, because capitalism is not a zero-sum game where somebody's profit or gain is somebody else's loss. It's a rising tide that is ultimately lifting all the boats. Socialism, on the contrast, has never succeeded, ever. No time, no place.
We get examples every year. The latest is Venezuela.
Venezuela's complete meltdown. We see it happen again and again and again. The intellectuals go on to the next one. I had a debate yesterday at Freedom Fest with a Marxist professor from Yale, and he admitted he didn't have any real world examples of socialism working, but it just hadn't been done right.
But next time, for sure.
Next time, if he had the power to make people do what he wants them to do, he believes socialism would work.
As a class, why are intellectuals so drawn to socialism? And what are you personally doing to win them over to think differently?
It's an interesting question. I have spoken out publicly about intellectuals hating capitalism, and they do. And they always have. I mean, they've always disliked commerce. If you study the history of business, the Jews were persecuted in the West. They were business class. And the Chinese were greatly persecuted in the East when they were in different countries. Intellectuals have seen business people as commerce kind of dirty, and they caricature it that they're only interested in money and profit, and they don't care about people, and they're greedy, and they're selfish, and they're exploitative. And that's been true throughout all history, so it's nothing new here. Nothing new here. If you want to speculate on it a little bit, well, envy is definitely a factor, although no one ever wants to talk about envy. No one ever wants to admit it as a motivating force. But they're very concerned about where they stand in social hierarchies. And in a capitalistic society, intellectuals are not at the top of the hierarchy.
The guy who makes toilet paper is higher on the list.
That's right.
And without him, life gets pretty rough.
And it really upsets the intellectuals because they believe they're a lot smarter than these business people, and yet the business people have more money and higher status. It seems all totally unfair to them. When they talk a lot about social justice and inequality, a lot of the fuel behind that is just simply an unhappiness where business people exist in our society. That's what they think is unfair. It's unfair that they're not more important than business people. They want to get them back under their thumb.
Why is religion so often at odds with capitalism? Issuing everything from fatwas against lending at interest to recent papal exhortations blaming economic inequality on the profit motive.
I think it's a similar reason. Intellectuals, by the way, have often been attracted to religion historically.
Not recently, but historically.
But if you look at the history of who, oftentimes, if you go back into the Western history, it was the religious people, the clerics, the priests, the ministers. Oftentimes, they're the only ones that were literate in the society. The great majority of people, 90%, couldn't read and write. So the intellectuals were the priests. So part of it is just wanting to control people. The market's disruptive. The market disrupts religion. It disrupts society. I think that's very threatening to all the religions. I think they see it as dangerous to the social order.
You've embarked on a mission to redefine or perhaps rehabilitate the reputation of capitalism, putting the word conscious in front of it. What is conscious capitalism, and why does it rest on a moral defense of freedom rather than just a utilitarian justification?
Well, since I don't think capitalism is going to go away anytime soon, and the brand is very damaged, it was, as you pointed out, Karl Marx did name it capitalism, and it's a misnomer. It's a bad name. If I was to make up a name from scratch, I would call it innovationism, because capital, the free market enterprise, is basically about innovation.
Capital itself is only one component.
It is only one component, and increasingly it's not the most important component.
It's a commodity.
Yeah, and today, it was scarce perhaps 200 years ago, but today it's abundant. What is more scarce are ideas to deploy that capital in ways that will produce higher than average returns. And in that sense, entrepreneurship is the driver of the economy, not capital. And that's why innovationism is a good name. Well, we call it conscious capitalism because it's basically a philosophy of doing business in a more conscious way. We talk about every business has, for example, a potential for higher purpose besides just making money. Doctors, for example, they make a lot of money in our society, but if you ask what the purpose of a doctor is, it would be to heal people.
Right. And is this higher purpose often captured in the mission statement of these companies?
It oftentimes is. Oftentimes a business has a higher purpose, but it's not yet explicit. Particularly an entrepreneur oftentimes hasn't become fully conscious of what's driving them. They have some kind of passion to realize something, a dream in the world, but they are seldom going after it just for the money. But they haven't made it explicit yet, haven't made it conscious yet. So conscious capitalism is making that purpose conscious. At the same time, it's also a second pillar of it is realizing that there are a variety of stakeholders in an organization.
Not just shareholders.
It's not just shareholders. There's customers, there's employees, there's suppliers, there's investors.
It's got to work for everybody or it doesn't work at all.
The truth is, capitalism does work for everyone, but we do such a bad job telling that story because the way the intellectuals portray it is, well, capitalism's for the rich class. They screw everybody and take most of the money for themselves.
Getting into details, if your vendors don't make money, how they can continue supplying you.
Exactly.
I can never figure this out, why people don't understand that.
People don't understand it. The capitalism ultimately is a win-win-win-win-win game. Everyone's trading voluntarily. No one has a gun to their head saying, you must trade with me at this price. People trade with each other voluntarily for mutual gain and benefit. And as a result, capitalism has this upward lift to it. So conscious capitalism is just getting people to think about it in a more conscious way.
For those just joining us, we're here on the floor of Freedom Fest with John Mackey, co-founder and co-CEO of Whole Foods. So, John, you have called business the greatest force for good on this planet. What did you mean by that? I
mean that business is the greatest value creator on this planet. It creates value for everyone that trades with it. It creates value for customers. It creates value for the people that work there, jobs, benefits, opportunities.
And when you say value, you mean in the eyes of the beholder, right?
Yes.
There's no like abstract outside power telling us what that value is?
Correct. Well, yeah, God isn't telling us these things. It's intrinsic to the people that are voluntarily trading. So it's creating value for customers. No one forces a customer to buy something from Whole Foods Market. They have alternatives in the marketplace. So if they are trading with us, it's because they feel like our quality, selection, pricing, convenience, service, etc., makes it worthwhile making the trade.
And you disappoint them once and you could lose them forever.
You can, exactly. So you have to serve them well. And competition forces you to do that. So you're creating value for customers, you're creating value for the employees and jobs, benefits, opportunities to grow, suppliers. You're their customer, and so by trading with you, their businesses flourish. Investors invest their capital, hoping to get a return on it. So if you're profitable, you're doing that. All nonprofits and governments are ultimately dependent on the business sector for taxes and for donations. It ultimately all comes from the business sector, as well as the larger world economy is driven by the value creation of business. So compare that to the value creation that a nonprofit does or a government does. Oftentimes, the intellectuals will portray that, well, government and nonprofits, they're doing this for the public good.
The greater good, right.
Whereas business is doing this for just their own selfish interest. That's just fundamentally not true. That business is the great value creator that undergirds, supports ultimately everything that happens for the nonprofit and the governmental sectors. But people don't understand that. So business is the greatest force for good. It is ending poverty on this planet. It is creating prosperity. It is making our lives better in countless ways. Just think about how different the world is today than it was just 15 years ago.
Yeah.
No one had a smartphone 15 years ago. No one was on Facebook. No one was using Uber. Google had just been created and was just beginning to do searches. And that's just in the last 15 years. If you go back further, in our lifetimes, there was no Apple computer, there was no Microsoft.
There was no color TV when we were kids.
There wasn't. There were just 3 channels on black and white.
So let me ask you a question. How does conscious capitalism deal with the criticism that profits for the business owner are really a form of exploitation against the worker because you're stealing their fair share?
Because that's a lie. That is the smear that Karl Marx has made and intellectuals have repeated over and over and over again, forgetting that, again, the trades are made voluntarily. No one is forced to work for Whole Foods Market. This whole idea that somehow that they are because they're going to starve to death.
Yeah, they have no choices.
Well, they do have choices because there are other places they can go work. I mean, for example, let's say there was no minimum wage law in the United States like there isn't in Sweden or Norway or Denmark or Iceland or other countries in the world. They have no minimum wages. Well, would that mean Whole Foods could be free to pay people 50 cents an hour? Well, we have the jobs. Why wouldn't we just pay everybody 50 cents an hour?
Do you think you'd find any workers for that price?
We wouldn't. No one would come work for us because they can get better paying jobs with our competitors. What forces wages up in a market economy through voluntary exchange is competition. We pay better than minimum wage, much better than minimum wage, because we want a higher caliber worker.
And you want to hold on to them.
And we don't want them to leave to take a better paying job. It's competition for workers, ultimately, that raises compensation. And that's been steady. People are getting paid far more today than they were getting paid 100 years ago, 150 years ago, adjusted for inflation. And that's been because the productivity of workers continues to go up.
You know, there's one phrase that's always bothered me when applied to successful businessmen, and that's giving back. It implies they owe their success to stealing from the community rather than providing jobs and services and taxes. Why do we encourage people to talk that way rather than calling them out?
One thing to understand is that there's a larger meta-narrative about business in our society, and that meta-narrative is business sucks. Business is greedy and selfish and exploitative.
You can't turn on the radio without hearing that.
But you could atone for the crime of being in business if you give back, if you are philanthropic, if you are charitable. You can't really save yourself, but at least good works indicate that maybe someday you could be redeemed.
You've put it in religious terms.
Well, because I think that's how it's oftentimes portrayed. that business is fundamentally sinners because they are stealing and exploiting and they're greedy. So they're condemned. They have original sin.
Original sin.
Yeah, that's right. So there is a deep underpinning of sort of religious framework for the condemnation of business that I reject and I think is incorrect.
So aside from cheating or harming people, what positive social responsibilities do business owners have under this broad stakeholder view of conscious capitalism?
Business is inherently socially responsible simply because it is creating value for its customers, it's creating value for its employees, for the suppliers it trades with, it pays taxes.
So it's in the DNA.
Yes, business is inherently socially responsible, but does that mean that's all it has to do? Well, in one sense, you could argue business is plenty socially responsible just being ethical and doing the right thing by each of its constituencies, each of its stakeholders. That being said, look, there are serious problems in the world that business alone can't solve. There are certain things. If a business can make a profit, then it probably belongs in the business sector for the entrepreneurs to try to create solutions for it. But in many cases, business can't make a profit.
Right, it's outside their
You look
realm.
at something like the Humane Society of the United States, which works with animals, dogs, cats, horses, livestock animals, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, no business is going to make a profit at that. So we need the civil society of nonprofits to try to solve these problems. Business can support that and should support that, because if we don't, then government's the only solution, and they're bureaucratic and not very entrepreneurial.
Wasn't that Benjamin Franklin's largest message? Civil society, civic associations providing good alongside business?
Yeah, I think it was one of his major communications. And if you look at the biography of Benjamin Franklin, one of my personal heroes, he organized in Philadelphia all types of voluntary societies, fire departments, libraries. He was always bringing people together to voluntarily work together to solve certain community problems. That's the way America used to solve its problems until government just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
So, John, talking about our historical roots, unleashing unrestrained democracy was among our founders' greatest fears. Yet, despite the strict limitations on federal power they put in place, here we are today. Is conscious capitalism or something like it necessary to keep the mob from killing the goose that laid the golden egg?
Yes, I think it
is.
That's
a straight answer.
Well, look, you see what's happening in our society right now. I mean, Bernie Sanders almost got the Democratic nomination. He's a socialist. Millennial generation is overwhelmingly now they're more supportive of socialism than capitalism. So unless capitalism can rebrand itself, recast itself, I'm afraid that the historical ignorance of an up-and-coming generation is going to wash it away.
Europe seems to have lost faith in economic freedom, and the U.S. isn't too far behind. More and more of our interactions are hemmed in by mountains of regulations whose negative impact on economic growth are pretty easy to see. What's the proper role of government under conscious capitalism?
That's a good question and probably a complex answer.
That's a whole show.
A simple way to do it is to say, look, whatever the private sector can do, can make money doing, it should do. And then the next area should be the civil society of nonprofit organizations trying to solve the problems voluntarily through donations and through cooperation, the problems that the private sector can't solve. I see government as kind of the last resort, the things that we can't do on our own. There are certain problems, for example, international problems that can't be solved just through the private sector, just through the nonprofit sector. So government has a role to play. It's an important role. The problem now in the United States is the government spending 40% of the gross domestic product.
Yeah.
They are way, way out of bounds. They're doing all kinds of things that they're not competent to do. I mean, at the end of the day, government is basically force. It has power through guns.
And they're making common cause with the crony capitalists, which is besmirching the brand.
They really are. And that's a real problem. And again, I think that's a longer, more complex, a show in and of itself talking about that.
Well, perhaps we'll have you back to talk about that. But John, if you don't mind, I'd like to wrap up by asking you a personal question.
Sure.
I'm a Costco guy and my wife is a Whole Foods gal. Is there any hope for our marriage?
Absolutely. You have to realize that women generally are smarter than men. And
She says that all the time.
You should be following your wife. You'll live longer if you do.
Well, John, thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of Freedom Fest.
Thank you.
That was John Mackey, co-founder and co-CEO of Whole Foods Market, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza, wrapping up our visit to the Freedom Fest conference in Las Vegas. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at the brand new RealClearFuture.com for updates on the next big wave of technologies. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.